sheer dumb luck. That's what you would call what happened to Air India Flight 301 on the 23rd of June 1985. A bomb that was inside a suitcase that was supposed to go inside Air India Flight 301 that was going to operate between Tokyo's Narita Airport and Bangkok's Don Mueang Airport instead exploded inside a baggage handling room at Tokyo's Narita Airport. This unfortunately killed 2 baggage handlers, but saved the plane. And that was because the perpetrators did not know that Japan did not follow daylight savings time. However, the passengers on board Air India Flight 182, operating between Toronto, Canada and London Heathrow in the UK, were not so lucky. 55 minutes after the blast at Tokyo's Narita Airport, a bomb did indeed go off inside the hold of the Emperor Kanishka, the name of the Boeing 747 that operated this flight. 329 people lost their lives in this accident. The worst act of terror before the attacks of September 11, 2001. It's an accident that many of us in India have chosen to forget, yet it remains controversial in Canada to this day. The events that led to the eventual downing of the Kanishka began in the late 1960s and through the 1970s. The economic decline of India in that period was felt particularly acutely in the northern state of Punjab. This led to mass migration to the United Kingdom and Canada. Troubles almost always lead to the rise of radical religious elements, and that happened in Punjab as well, where a group of puritanical Sikh clergy, led by Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, first started attacking the Nirankari sect and eventually grew their protests for a separate Sikh homeland and started acting against the Indians. The Sikh militancy problem gradually got worse. The state, the Punjab police, and the Indian army in constant gun battles with militants, eventually cornering them, forcing the militants to take a huge cache of weapons inside the Sanctum Sanctorum of Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple. And in a decision that would ultimately cost her her life, Indira Gandhi ordered the Indian army inside the Golden Temple to flush the militants out. Operation Blue Star was the result. The desecration of the Golden Temple by the Indian army led to a huge amount of resentment among the Sikh population and also among the Sikh emigre population in Canada. Radical elements in the Sikh emigre population funded forces inimical to India, and this eventually led to Indira Gandhi's assassination in October 1984. Unfortunately, Mrs. Gandhi's assassination was followed by what could only be described as a pogrom against Sikhs that was supported by the ruling Congress party of the day. Many thousands of Sikhs were murdered, raped, and mutilated across North India, particularly in Delhi. The calls for revenge and attack on Indian assets both in India and abroad were led by a host of terrorist organizations, including Babbar Khalsa International, one of whose leaders was a gentleman known as Talwinder Singh Parmar. The Indian government had in the past tried to have him extradited to the country, both from Canada and later on from Germany. However, both attempts failed. By early 1984, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Security Services had already received information from informants that attempts were going to be made to bomb Air India Flight 182. These reports were dismissed by the police. However, by then, the Canadians had already started to keep an eye on Parmar, who they suspected were responsible for attacks on moderate Sikhs in Canada as well as assassinations in the Punjab. Enter Inderjeet Singh Riat, an auto mechanic who lived outside Vancouver, British Columbia. A follower of Parmar, he had been approached by the Babbar Khalsa leader to try and construct a bomb. Riat approached many of his friends and acquaintances for knowledge on how to construct a bomb, mentioning it was because of problems in the old country. Early May 1985, Riat had acquired enough knowledge on how to construct a bomb along with a timer that can be planted inside a suitcase that would go on board an aircraft. The Canadian security services were already wiretapping Parmar's phone, and they were concerned about the volume of traffic between Parmar and Riyadh. However, 3 days before the bombing, on the 20th of June 1985, a call was made to a Canadian Pacific Airlines office in Vancouver, and 2 tickets were bought. One on Canadian Pacific Flight 86 between Vancouver and Toronto, and onward onto Air India Flight 181 and then 182 to Mumbai, and a ticket on Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 003 to Tokyo, and onward to Air India Flight 301 to Bangkok. Tickets were booked in the name of a Mr. Jaswant Singh and a Mr. Mohinder Singh. The names were subsequently changed to M. Singh and L. Singh. And the next day, a gentleman with a turban went to the Canadian Pacific ticket office in Vancouver and paid for the tickets with $3,000 cash. Major aviation disaster. It takes a sequence of things to go wrong for the disaster to finally occur. Any one break in the chain, and maybe this horrific incident might not have occurred. The passenger known as M. Singh bullied the check-in agent Janini Adams to ensure that his suitcase, a hard-sided Samsonite, was checked in all the way from Vancouver to Mumbai despite his Air India ticket not being confirmed. She had asked him to double-check with the authorities at Toronto. The second thing that went wrong was that the X-ray machine at Toronto airport failed that day. Air India was acutely aware of the terrorist threats against it following Mrs. Gandhi's assassination and the anti-Sikh riots. Air India Flight 301 had extremely good fortune. Air India Flight 182, unfortunately, got the bad luck. The suitcase with the bomb went on board. 8:15 p.m. Canadian time, the Boeing 747-237B, registered Victor Tango Echo Foxtrot Oscar, named Emperor Kanishka, took off from Toronto Pearson Airport for Montreal Mirabel Airport, where it arrived at 9 p.m. Canadian time. After waiting for an hour, Air India Flight 182 took off from Montreal for the very last time. Flight 182 departed for London at 10 p.m. Canadian time. It was en route to Palam Airport in New Delhi as well as Sahar Airport in Mumbai. 329 people were on board, 307 passengers and 22 crew. It was captained by Hanse Singh Narendra, and Captain Satwinder Singh Bhinder served as first officer. Dara Domasia was the flight engineer. Most of the passengers were Canadian citizens but of Indian origin and were going back home to visit family and friends. At around 7:10 Greenwich Mean Time, the crew of the Boeing 747 squawked 2005, a routine activation of its aviation transponder as was requested by the Shannon Airport Air Traffic Control that monitors traffic over the Atlantic approaching Europe. Less than 5 minutes later, at 7:14 GMT, the plane, while cruising at 31,000 feet, vanished from radar screens at Shannon Air Traffic Control. The bomb that had been constructed by Inderjit Singh Rayat had exploded, and the Air India Boeing 747 disintegrated immediately. Most passengers died almost instantaneously when exposed to the cold, low-pressure air outside. A large number of passengers, 268 of them to be precise, were Canadian citizens. 82 passengers were children and infants. Many of the passengers were Sikhs. This was an unmitigated disaster, not just for India, but also for Canada. God saved Air India Flight 301 from the same fate as Air India Flight 182. But the evidence recovered from Tokyo's Narita Airport bombing helped investigators trace back the bombs to Riyadh and Parmar. Riyadh was the only one of the conspirators to ever face justice. After he was arrested by the Canadian police from the United Kingdom, where he had moved to after the bombing. He spent 30 years in a Canadian prison but was recently, in 2016, released on parole. Parma returned to India at the height of the Sikh militancy but was gunned down by the Punjab police in an encounter in 1992. He remains a martyr to many in Canada. And indeed, Jagdeep Singh, the leader of the New Democratic Party in Canada, got into a political pickle when he refused to condemn the bombers of Air India 182. The accident has been very controversial and very painful in Canada. And while we remember the Pan Am 103 bombing because the images of the half-blown 747 lying in a field in Scotland are seared into our minds, the Air India 182 accident does not get much mention in India. Indeed, there is not a single memorial to this accident in India, despite involving an Indian aircraft and being the worst terrorist attack before September 11th. Do subscribe and watch this channel for more such interesting content.